Hi, this is the refilming of the live watercolor workshop that I hosted last week. That video is super glitchy. I was having some issues, so I'm refilming it. We're going to be painting something similar to this, which is one of my pieces of art, which has been licensed. Um, so let's get to it. I'm going to show you step by step. I'm going to explain all my supplies. The paper that I'm using today is actually not paper I use very often, but I'm always trying to try some new paper. So for these types of projects that use, this is going to be a lot of wet on wet and fun textures. I like pure cotton cold press, and so this is the version that I'm using. If you're interested in the other papers that I love, I like this one a lot, which is a German paper. I think it's called Hanemule. I'm sure that I'm probably butchering that. I sometimes will use Ache, which is also, people call it Arches. It's pronounced Ache because that one's French. I love this one. This is not cotton, but this is actually a really good non-cotton watercolor paper, and it's inexpensive. I highly recommend this. And then Fabriano, I love this paper for anytime you want the paint to spread and be kind of soft. That's my printer in the background. I don't know if you can hear that, but those are the papers that I like. This is the one I'm using today. For today's workshop, you will need cold press watercolor paper, ideally 100% cotton. This is a test strip for colors and water consistency, 2 jars of water, some kind of palette for mixing colors. Round brushes, I have a variation here, so ideally like 2, 4, 6, 8, somewhere around there. You can do it with a variety of them, but I would probably have one smaller one and one bigger one. And then the colors that we'll be using are Prussian blue, Viridian. I love Holbein. This is not a paid ad, they're just my favorite paints. They're so vibrant and they last a really long time. And anyway, using Holbein. I also have Winsor Newton and Daniel Smith in my palette, but today I'm using these. And Brilliant Orange, so you need some kind of orange like this that's either like a red orange or just an orangey orange, but nothing that's too yellow. And then burnt sienna is optional. And then this, you either need some kind of paper towel or some kind of cloth. I like to have both on hand. And yeah, we'll get started. So the first thing I'm going to show you is I'm going to explain, oh, one more thing, sorry, salt. This is another cool supply. This is just table salt. Any salt will do. I keep mine in a container. The salt is for texture, and if you'd like that, it creates cool effects, so that's another thing. The reason for the 2 jars of water is if you rinse your brush off first in the what will become the dirty one, and then a cleaner glass of water, not only does your brush get cleaner, but you keep 1 jar of water that's relatively clean, and then you can pull clean water right off of that onto the paper for the wet and wet technique. Okay, so on my palette, I already have the Prussian blue and the Viridian over here, and then my, I don't know if it should, yeah, there it is, okay. The orange and the burnt sienna here. So I'm just going to show you first some color mixing and a little bit of color theory. So this blue, you'll see, is just a really beautiful, bright, vibrant blue. And then if I want to tone that down to be a more muted, like navy color, I can add this orange, because that is the complement of the blue on the color wheel. So complement means that it's the opposite. Whenever you add the opposite, you will mute down or desaturate the color. So you'll see, and you just kind of play with it until you get the mixture that you want. But you'll see that that creates this navy, way more muted color. And you can make whatever color you want that suits your personality and your fancy. I couldn't resist doing that. This paper is that fluid paper. It really is just nice paper. And then if you want to mix a little bit of the green in there, you get this like really dark, oh, that's probably too much green. You get this vibrant green color, and then I'm going to put some orange back in there and a little more blue. So I want mine to be darker and more muted than that. And you can also just use different variations of the colors throughout, so just play with it a little bit. But if you want more of a foresty green, you can add this burnt sienna into a heavy green mix, and you're going to get a darker, sorry, wrong color, burnt sienna. You'll get more of a like foresty green color. So make it yours. I'm going to make mine more of a blue color, but I would mix up the color that you like and start from there. The first thing we're actually going to do before we start in on the final painting is I'm just going to take you through a couple of quick exercises, and I'm just going to actually use my test strip for this. So if you're brand new to watercolor, this is important, and if you're not, you can skip through this part and get to the part where we actually paint it. But I'm just going to zoom in here and show you the difference between a couple of techniques. So I'm going to just put water on my paper here. You can see if I turn it on an angle, you can see it's kind of hard to see the shine, but it's definitely shiny and completely wet, but it's not like a puddle of water. So if you put water on the paper and then you drop some paint into that water, that's called the wet and wet technique. And that will diffuse the paint and make it soft. That's how you get soft edges in watercolor. And you can mix things in there and just sort of let it do what watercolor does. One of the elements of, or one of the attributes that watercolor has is that it's unpredictable, and you kind of have to get comfortable with that. You can create, or I'll go over textures in a second, but if you just take a wet brush, so if you'll notice the way I'm loading my brush, it's not like this. I'm loading it sideways. Loading means putting paint and water into your brush so that my brush is completely saturated with water and paint. It's not dripping, but it's definitely saturated. And I'm going to go and just lay that on the dry paper. And this is called wet on dry. So this is how you get hard edges. And if you want to soften an edge, like if you've put something down like that, but you want one of the edges to be diffused, you can just grab a clean brush and drag it along the edge, and it will soften that edge right there. And the way that you get some of the textures that we're going to use, a couple things you can do. You can either drop water right in the drying paint, just like this. It's already drying and my brush was just loaded with water, no paint. Or you can use salt. The salt you want to put on your paint when it's on the way to drying but not completely dry. And it's kind of hard to see what will happen yet because it happens as it dries, but basically the water and the pigment push away from the salt and create those really interesting textures, which are referred to as blooms in watercolor. And then finally, I just want to go over the way to hold your brush for what we're going to be doing for trees. So I'm going to load this tiny brush. I'm actually not going to be using a brush this small for the final piece, but this is a 1. Oh, I also personally like squirrel hair and sable brushes for my work, but you can also find some decent synthetic brushes. So as long as it holds onto water, you can really use any good round brush that comes to a point like that. So I'm not going to hold my brush like this or like a pencil. I'm going to hold it almost upright, and my grip is pretty loose because the motion that we're going to be making for the trees is just sort of this relaxed loose motion. Tree branches don't go down like this that you see, like when you were a kid and you drew trees. They actually, branches come out like this. So you just want to hold your brush upright like that, because that will let you use the tip of the brush and get those sort of fine lines. And then you're just going to bring your strokes outward like that. And then we're going to take a loaded brush with water, it's just got water on it, and pull the paint out of there. And then I'm going to create another one that's darker right next to it with the same exact technique. So I'm going to hold my brush. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see better. Again, upright. I'm just going to start with the top of it and make these outward, loose. Another thing I'm doing is my hand is not tight. My wrist is moving, and my muscles are loose, and my grip is loose when I'm doing this. And I'm going to build it right into this wet area, and you'll see it just sort of merge together there. You can drop in some darker pigment. And then pull that paint out of there to keep that texture going. When you're painting with watercolor, if you have experience with other paint mediums, it will be helpful for you if you think of it like pushing water around, pushing a puddle of water around, as opposed to thicker paint like gouache or acrylic, is that you always want your consistency of your paint to be, unless you want a thick, opaque wash, but generally you want your layers to be transparent. So you want this sort of watery, probably like coffee or coffee with milk consistency, and then you're just sort of pushing that water around. And if your brush is too dry, you'll get like a dry brush technique. So you'll get this texture, and that's okay too if that's what you want. And if it's too wet, you're going to get, like, you don't want this. You don't want like puddles of water. That will make your paper buckle, but that will also create hard edges. So this really is a project that you can make yours, but those are the different things that you're going to get out of it if you make those certain choices. So pause me if you need to, and spend some time sort of practicing and get comfortable with that. And I am going to zoom out a little bit so you can see. Just kind of, I'll zoom in again in a minute so that you can see the paper closer, but this is going to be on an angle from left to right. If you are right-handed, it's ideal for you to start on the left-hand side so that you're not dragging your hand across paint. If you start over here, you would be doing that. If you're left-handed, it's better to start on the right-hand side and go down. And we're going to work in thirds, so this is a compositional rule. Ideally, you want to think about your paper in thirds or your composition in thirds, so I'm not going to measure and be real precise about it, but I want the top half of my trees to start in the bottom third, and then it's going to move up to the top third, so they're going to move on an angle. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is actually just wet my paper. And move it along that diagonal edge. This paper that I'm using is very absorbent, so that's the reason I'm laying some water down first, because I want everything to sort of flow. And then I'm going to just mix up the color that I want, which is a good bit of blue, the Prussian blue. You'll notice that I do this a lot, or dab my brush on the towel, and that's to get any excess water off the brush. I want it to be full of water, but I don't want it to be so full of water that it's like dripping off the brush. So that's why I'm doing that. I want to have this like blue-green color, but a little bit more muted. And I'm going to let mine be different colors throughout my painting. So I'm going to leave this has more green here and more blue over here. I'm going to do that on purpose. This is the color that I'm going to use on my test strip. It's always a good idea to have a test strip so you can test out to see if the color that you have is the one that you want. Okay, so I'm going to start with this round 2. I'm going to load that up. And then I'm going to start with my first tree over here, holding the brush like I showed you. Just sort of loosely that first tree, and then you'll see the paper's already wet, which is the reason it's spreading. And I want that to happen because I like that. And then I'm just going to make a slightly lighter tree right next to that one. Anything that's darker will be, like a darker value will appear to be closer to the foreground, and anything that's lighter, people or whoever's viewing it will assume that that's like a further away object. That's just like a rule. I'm going to zoom the camera in so you can see better what I'm doing here. Oop, too much. Okay. You can make your trees various sizes also. I've decided that I want a bigger brush, so I'm going to switch to a 4. And I'm just going to do my next tree, which is going to be taller and larger. So you can see up here I'm getting a little bit of that dry brush look, getting some texture because I don't have a ton of water on my brush. And I like that. There, I like the variation. And then I'm just going to clean my brush off. And this is just water now. And I'm going to pull that out of there. So I got a little bit more water than I wanted there, and I'm just going to lift some of it off with my brush. You can use a brush or a paper towel for that. And then this is still wet, so I'm going to add some of this like darker navy color in here. Watercolor has like a time frame basically for drying, so you want to work on it while it's definitely still wet. When it's almost dry but not totally dry yet is kind of a dangerous spot to work on your watercolor. It's better to wait for the layer to dry at that point because you'll overwork it or potentially ruin your paper. Okay, so I'm going to make another one that's pretty close to that one. And it's like a little bit of a fatter tree. Now I want a really light tree next to that one because I want it to be in the background. So the way that you do that in watercolors, instead of using white, you just have mostly water on your brush. This is super watery. And so I'm going to get a really light color there. And then if you want a darker color, you just use more paint. So more water is going to be a paler, softer color, and more paint is going to be a darker value. I find it difficult to paint and talk simultaneously. Alright, so I want some variation too, like a good bit of variation in my darks and my lights. So the next tree is going to be a darker tree. And I also want I don't want the same amount of space between my trees, so I'm actually going to move over here, and I'm going to bring this one up higher, because we're moving up at an angle. I want a darker area down here because I'm going to add salt to that. So I'm going to drop more paint there. And I'm going to add salt. You can do that if you want to. You don't have to. This is a super fun, creative, do whatever you want to do because it's your art kind of project. So hopefully you're doing that. Just do what you like best. Okay, and then I'm going to do another dark tree, or maybe a grouping of them, and then some light trees probably. Make it a little taller. And I'm just going to jump right to the next one because I want it to be another one of these dark blue colors. I already have a good bit of water here, so I'm just going to pull up some of that paint and make a couple of light trees right out of that existing paint. Like barely there. Background. Oh, that's probably too much. Alright, I'm going to add some darker paint, heavy on the navy. Here. This is a bigger tree. Again, I'm moving up at that angle. Oh, that came out a lot more green than I anticipated, but I like it. Happy little accident. I've decided I'm going to start paying homage to Bob Ross. Happy little accident. I'm going to add some more salt right there. Actually, you know what? I'm going to just add water so that you can see. See, it does the same thing. Put a tiny bit of salt on top of it. Another like a dark tree right here. See, this is like closer together. So I have some variation. I'm just going to put that paint. out of there. A little more green. I'm going to mix some of this red sienna. Get something more green. So that's probably too green because it's really going to stand out there. I'm going to move that down. Some of the navy. You can drop in dark areas if you like that.